Good afternoon. Hi, my name is Lee Costin, and my oral presentation is on the role of the reader. And when we're talking about the role of the reader, we're talking about as it relates to textual criticism. We're looking at what the reader's response is to a given text. Looking at the reader of the New Testament, we look at the position that the reader chooses to take in interpretation of the text or how he responds to the text. Reading is not just a matter of perception, but also of production. When the reader reads, he does not do so much as discover, but he also creates meaning. There would be no meaning of text if there were no readers. There are two explanations on that. We have a philosophical explanation and a literary explanation. The philosophical explanation, a reader's response to text, it has the historical background of reader's response criticism goes back to Kant's Copernican's revolution, where knowledge was defined as a mind apprehending an object. Kant argued that the knower contributes something to the object of knowledge, and that the mind does not simply mirror, but it constructs its object, processing sensations outside the mind with the mind's own concepts for understanding. The literary explanation gives us three ages of criticism. The first age is the author oriented view, and that's where the author is the effect of the text. Understanding meant occupying the same place and perspective as the author. And the second, we as the readers are distant from the author. And the third is the language that comes between the reader and the author. Those three elements are summed up as mind, time, and language. Once the author is removed from the text, literary critics have attempted to find out principles for how one determines the meaning based on the text alone. The role of the reader, what he does, is we want to figure out when he reads, what does he do when he reads besides moving his eyes from left to right? Traditionally, he reads to get an understanding. In other words, to grasp the author's understanding. Reader response criticism takes it one step further to determine the meaning to the ways the text is received by the reader. That is to say, meaning is not simply reproduced, but produced. The challenge facing us as biblical interpreters is not the biblical text that we read, but our ways of interpreting them. There's two types of reader's response. We have reader reception and we have reader rejection. Reader reception is where understanding is the end goal, and reading is more or less an obedient activity. Here, the reader respects the author's intentions and textual strategies. Then the reader rejection is a radical reader. The text becomes an opportunity for the reader to pursue his or her own interests and agenda. Readers do not respond to the text, they react. Reactionary readers lobby for their respective causes and views. This could be dangerous because it goes against the history, or could go against the history of the text's original interpretation. Here, the reader rejects the author's intentions and his strategies. The process of understanding is between the text and the reader. Hans Georg Gadamer, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, he describes it, the reader and the text, as a fusion of two horizons. If we look at the reader response, reader respect theory, we have the active reading produces patterns and realizes meaning. Reading is the process of filling in the blanks, making connections. This is an applied reader who is an effect of the text. These readers are also called real readers that are active readers. Their activity is limited to a prescripted role laid down in the text that could be considered slavery to the text. The interpretation of the text differs as a result of the different interactions between the text proposal and the reader's response. Here, the reader is active, but his activity is oriented to just receiving the text. On the opposite end of the spectrum, we have The radical reader response is the reader resistance. This theory, here the reader attempts to find and fix the meaning of the text. Radical readers resist any claim that either textual or interpretive pretend to be authoritative, exclusive, or absolute. The criteria for interpretation comes from within the interpretive community that reader comes from. The reader belongs in a community, and what a reader discovers is a function of that community. And meaning is a reading strategy brought about from that community that he belongs. If we apply those two theories to the application of text, the book gives us an example of John 4. John 4 tells us the story of Jesus meeting a woman at the well. We know enough about Jesus and his purpose as we read chapters 1 through 3. It does a beautiful job setting up Jesus, his deity, and that his word was made flesh, how he turned water into wine, he cleansed the temple, and he tells Nicodemus about the new birth experience and salvation. As a receptive reader, we follow that story all the way through. And when we get to chapter 4, we would have no reason to think that he had any type of sexual overtures with the woman at the well when he asked her for a drink. When we get to chapter 4, it tells us about the story. However, a radical reader could ask, well, did Jesus ask her for a drink of water because his disciples were unavailable, or because he and the woman were alone and he wanted to flirt? A receptive reader would take into consideration that the stage has already been set based on their reading of him in the previous chapters, versus a resistant reader. They're going to try and make the story, read more into the story, maybe than what it is, or get a different interpretation instead of just following the author all the way through to that point. Now, the effectiveness of both of those methods, the pros and the cons, when we're looking at the effectiveness, a key question concerns the nature of the activity and what the reader's response is to what he's reading. Will the reader respect or suspect or obey or rebel against them? To what extent does the reader's response infect or enable the interpretive stages of explication, understanding, and application? We have to look at criticism of using and interpreting the text. When we speak of criticism, criticism is the reader's claim to enjoy a privileged perspective from how he's going to use or evaluate the text. When a reader responds to the text, they must respond responsibly. When one is approaching the biblical text, they should seek to understand before overstanding. A reader should first determine the nature of the text, what it's trying to communicate, the communication, the intent, before seeking to evaluate it. Find out what is it trying to say. In other words, what is the text trying to do? How is it doing it? By doing so is to treat the text justly, entertain his perspective, and heed his voice. This approach is going to require honesty and integrity. It is important that a reader evaluate the significance of a text only after they've understood the sense of the text. Understanding precedes criticism, and interpretation precedes use. Then there's a possibility of misreading. There's a difference between disagreeing about what one thinks the text is trying to say and deliberately reading the text. Green gives us an example about a reader that says in his mind, when I use the word, it means just what I choose it to mean. Nothing more, nothing less. That type of strong-willed reading raises a question of interpretive violence. Doing this victimizes a text. And then there's reading ethically. Readers have to realize that the meaning of the text is there in the text. Since the text is at the mercy of the reader, then readers should let it be. Not in the sense of leaving it alone, but to allow it to fulfill its communicative purpose. An ethical reader gives to the text attention. Only then can the text give something back. A biblical scholars, we have to be a servant and guard its otherness. The prime interpretation is to let the text have its say, which is to heed and to hearken to the text's attention. As students of the word, we have two models to help us understand how readers treat the text on two opposite ends of the spectrum. Competent readers need to know the scriptures, they need to know the story of Jesus, and must be a part of the community that follows and lives out the gospel insights. If you believe in Jesus and who he is, you will have no reason to believe any type of negative connotation, as the example gives us in John 4 when we look at um, the, the textual view of the receptive reader and the one that is resistant. By knowing the character of Jesus, you already know how to receive John 4 and other texts in the chapters like that. Basically, we need to really come to, I say, as a happy medium. You know, any type of a stream is not good. So we don't, when we read, we don't want to read where we're so passive or we just take in everything that we're being read, that we're reading. We do need to uh, critique or be able to criticize our text in a healthy way. But at the same time, we don't want to take the opposite on the spectrum where we're going in reading, okay, well, how can I change this? Or that's not what they mean. So belonging to a community, in our case, the apostolic community, that helps guides our interpretation of the text. It helps us understand what the text is trying to say. And then also when reading other things, besides the Bible, as I like to say, it helps us to be able to um, spit out the bones and eat the meat of the fish. I've enjoyed this. I've enjoyed this section on the role of the reader is very inspiring, and I also encourage the rest of you all to read it. Good night, you all. Be blessed and